In a previous video, when I was talking about the passing of Charlie Kirk, I posed a question towards the end of that video, and I said, how did our society get to this point? How did our society get to the point where violence was an acceptable response to disagreement rather than, discourse to discover differences and stuff like that? So I'm pursuing that thread here. How did our society get to that point? So I'm calling this the breakdown of society. How did we get to this position? Okay, so before I get into that, there's two axioms that I want to lay out. And the first one I think should be universally accepted. Most people recognize this. But the first axiom is that actions flow from belief. We tend to express this as, we tend to express this as actions speak louder than words. But it's the idea that, you can say one thing, but when you do something differently, what are you going to believe? Are you going to believe what somebody says or what somebody does? And the fact of the matter is, we place a greater emphasis on what they do over what they say. And we've seen a lot of this type of hypocrisy in action. For example, like with climate change, you hear about celebrities and politicians and all the hot shots. They talk about, save the planet and reduce your carbon footprint and all this other stuff. But these same people that are encouraging us mere mortals to watch our carbon footprint, they're the ones jet setting all over the globe. So there's that disconnect between what they say and what they actually do. And so this axiom that I've posited here, actions flow from belief, that tells you that they don't really believe the climate change nonsense. Because if they did, they would act accordingly. Further evidence of that, a lot of these hot shots, they're concerned about polar ice caps melting and sea level rising and all that kind of stuff, save the polar bears. But what do? They buy multi-million-dollar mansions right on the ocean. Beachfront property, if you will. So obviously they don't believe the stuff that's coming out of their mouth because their actions flow from their belief. They don't believe that the world is in imminent danger of being flooded or otherwise disappearing due to climate change. Otherwise they wouldn't bother spending all that money buying all these nice fancy mansions right on the ocean. We also have seen it with the illness that shall not be named. A lot of these politicians, they're trying to scare the pants off of everybody. And not just politicians, a lot of celebrities too. They're trying to scare the pants off of everybody by saying, you got to stay home, social distance, get your shot, get your mask, blah, 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 blah. But as soon as they thought the TV cameras were off, they were the first ones to whip off their mask. And I tell you, if they really believed that the illness that shall not be named was so horribly dangerous, they would have been the first ones to hide in their bunker for months or years if need be until the danger was past. Obviously, they didn't do that. They don't believe a word of what they're saying. They recognize that it's propaganda. And so they act in hypocrisy because they don't really believe it. So let me just wrap up this part about axiom, what I'm calling axiom number 1. Let me wrap it up by saying this. A person's actions will always tell you what their priorities are, because people spend their time, they spend their money, and they spend their energy on things that are important to them. So that's the first thing I want to say. Bear that in mind. The second axiom is probably not so widely accepted, and not nowadays, at least it used to be when the West had a more Christian mindset. And the second axiom is this, that man bears the Imago Dei. Man bears the image of God. God created man in his image. And that's not to say that man perfectly reflects who God is, but in some way or shape, however imperfectly, God bears that reflection of, man, humanity, bears that reflection of God, albeit imperfectly. But anyways, this belief, this axiom, man bears the Imago Dei, that is foundational for how we treat our fellow man. And if you stop and think about it, that kind of makes sense. Okay. Park ranger coming by just to say hello and check that everything's okay, I guess. Anyways, the Imago Dei, man bears the image of God. It's foundational because it provides a basis for respect for all stages of life. Because Christians believe that every person bears the image of God, we respect the preborn, we respect the very young, we respect the very old, we respect the sick and the infirm and the retarded and everything like that. By respect, I mean we care for these people. We don't discard them and say their lives are not worthy, but we honor that and we aim to protect that. So, and if you stop and think about it, the founding fathers also had this belief, because what did Thomas Jefferson write in the Declaration of Independence? He wrote, all men, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Now, why did he say that? Obviously, some people are smarter, some people are not so smart, some people are rich, some people are poor. But why did he write all men are created equal? Because of this axiom that man bears the Imago Dei. And if you stop and think about it, this idea that all men are created equal, that is foundational for true justice. So in other words, equal treatment under the law. Of course, now we've strayed far from that principle, but originally that principle meant that it didn't matter if you were rich or poor or smart or dumb or whatever. You would be treated equally before the law. You couldn't be pulling strings and saying, oh, because I have this, then therefore you should treat me like that. No, everyone was treated equally. And that's possible only with this notion of every person bearing the Imago Dei. Now you might say, well, what about the death penalty? Doesn't that kind of go against that? Isn't that a violation of this principle? Well, I would say no, because the death penalty, it's not retribution or revenge, but it's judicial. It's a judicial punishment for actually failing to recognize that everybody bears the image of God. Every man bears the image of God. Because when you believe that every single person bears the image of God, whether they're rich, they're poor, they're smart, they're whatever, they're handicapped, it doesn't matter. Every single person bears the image of God, and therefore their life is precious. And if you take it upon yourself to deprive that other person of their life through murder or what have you, then you're violating this principle, because you don't have the right to take someone else's life. Every life is precious, and that is reserved for God alone, when their time is up, when their number is up. We die. Everyone's like that. We don't decide when we're going to die, and we don't decide when someone else is going to die. But You can say, well, doesn't the death penalty violate that? Well, no, because a death penalty is arrived at judicially, not extrajudicially. Okay, so those are the two axioms. So, I believe how this breakdown of society has arisen is because we've rejected the second axiom. Namely, we've rejected the idea that man bears the image of God. And we could even back it up a step further and say that the reason why we've rejected, as a society, we've rejected this notion that every man bears the image of God is because we as a society have rejected God. When you reject God, then everything else just doesn't hold together. When you reject God, then you believe that man makes God in his own image, and man worships his own creation. And if you reject God, then you become the center of the universe. You become the arbiter of what is true and what is right and what is just and what is wrong. And that explains a lot about society, doesn't it? And if you reject God, if you reject the idea that man bears the Imago Dei, then you're going to have callous disregard for all human life. You see it with abortion and selling baby body parts. You see it with the push for euthanasia, the idea that, you know, we should determine who's suffering and whose life is worthy of living. That's not our judgment to make, but when you reject the Imago Dei, you think you can do that. We also see that with assisted suicide, like Dr. Death and Jack Kevorkian, where people decide they just, you know, they can't handle life anymore. And actually we see it with the anti-death penalty crowd, because they believe that the perpetrator is greater than the victim, in essence, if you're saying that, well, no, we should allow the perpetrator to live. Well, the perpetrator made a decision to destroy, wanton destruction of innocent human life. That is the definition of murder. But we have all these things wholesale now in society because we, as a society, have rejected God and we've rejected the Imago Dei. And you also see it with selfishness. There's a lot of people that just say, since they believe that there is no God, they put themselves as the center of the universe, and then they say, well, hooray for me, and the heck with all the rest of you. So you see that cropping up with, for example, all the fraud that we've seen in the news recently, because they don't care about anybody else. They only care about themselves and how they can get rich quick, or, you know, steal money from others. They don't care about anybody else. They don't care about their fellow man with the Imago Dei. They're only thinking of themselves. But what do you get when you follow this path of rejection of God and callous disregard for human life? It leads to one place, and it leads to anarchy. Anarchy being the rejection of all standards, because, as I said, when you reject God, you place yourself in the center of the universe. You are the determiner of right and wrong, and if you've gone down that path, then you've already rejected all standards, because it's just whatever you say. So that's how we get the law of the jungle. That's how we get that's how we get the law of the jungle. That's how we get situational ethics. That's how we get might makes right. And the law of the jungle is brutal. And if you want to see a current example of the taste of that, look at what's happening in Minneapolis right now. Look at all the quote-unquote protesters that don't give a flying fig about what the law says, and the police have stepped down and they're out there brutalizing and intimidating and terrorizing anybody who dares to disagree with them, because they themselves have made themselves the center of the universe. They are the sole arbiters of right and wrong, and if you cross them, they feel free to beat you up and rob you of your life. Complete anarchy. Minneapolis is just a taste of what complete anarchy would look like. So that's how society got this way. So what can we do about it? Well, I'm going to save that ultimate answer for another video, but I will just posit this. It's fundamentally a spiritual problem. Rejection of God is a spiritual problem. It cannot be remedied with politics. It cannot be remedied with education. It cannot be remedied with economics. Spiritual problems can only be fixed with a spiritual solution. So I'm going to touch upon that in an upcoming video. So I hope I've given you something to think about. If so, please give this video a thumbs up, like it, subscribe, and it's about time for me to wrap this up because the light is fading fast. So I'll talk to you later. Bye.